Hello everyone and welcome to episode number 5 of All Your Basics. Today we're going to be building a pure combo deck. We're going to try and assemble a bunch of synergies with some underwhelming looking cards to do some completely crazy things. So one of the things I wanted to include in this series was a Mechazor deck. I don't know if you've come across the Mechazor squad before. So these units are little robots with fairly mediocre stats, but once you've played 5 of them, you get Mechazor, which is an 8/8 untargetable, ranged, frenzied unit with airdrop, and you just get that for free. It just appears on the board anywhere you want it, and your opponent gets a little scared, and probably loses to it, ideally. There are a few ways around it. You know, if you can't target Mechazor itself, but you can target the square that it's on with things like Ephemeral Shroud or Chromatic Cold. You can use Lightbender to also stand next to it and dispel it. You can blow it up with Sunset Paragon, and of course you can hit it with minions, but generally there are very few ways to deal with it effectively. And it deals 8 damage a turn, at minimum, thanks to its frenzy. So getting that out is a really powerful play that will often win you games on the spot. So you'll notice that not all of these mechs are particularly low rarity. Chassis is an epic, and Alter Rex is legendary, which for some reason I have 3 copies of. But that's okay, we don't really need the expensive ones. We're going to be using these 4: Helm, Wings, Cannon and Sword, which are, you know, plenty if you've got enough card draw. And today we're going to be building an Abyssian deck. So, as you've probably figured out, I'd like to include each faction once in this series, or at least once. I might go beyond number 6 if I think of more ideas that are worth making into a video. And I was going to do Shadow Nova Control, because it's really budget friendly. So there's a lot of different ways you can build this deck, and because Shadow Nova is basic, you always have access to the key card of the archetype. So Shadow Nova doesn't necessarily look like much if you've never seen it in action, but by filling the board with increasing amounts of damage, you have what's called inevitability. You have this really good long game power where the longer the game goes on, the more likely you are to win, because you have Shadow Novas in your deck and you can generate more and more creep on the board itself. Unfortunately, Counterplay have announced that Shadow Nova is going to be reworked in the upcoming expansion, which I believe comes out on sort of the end of August, so in about a month. And I don't really want to build a video that will be invalidated in a month. That's not very useful. So back to the drawing board with that one. The other famous Abyssian archetype is Swarm Abyss. So this is based on Lilithe, who can make Wraithlings very easily with her Bloodborne spell. And you use things like Bloodmoon Priestess, which gives you more Wraithlings when any minion dies, and Shadow Dancer, which damages your opponent and heals you when minions die, to profit off of that. Unfortunately, that deck also, in practice, leans on a lot of higher rarity cards. Mostly Abyssian's legendaries. There are several legendaries and 1 epic, Black Solus, that are typically found in especially the Swarm decks, and you kind of need them to absorb removal because your key combo pieces are very fragile. Fortunately for us, we can replace, to some extent, the high rarity cards. You know, we can replace some of these legendaries with mechs and just have 2 combos in one. Or, vice versa, we can build a mech deck where we have our 4 cheap robots. If I could just go back to this. We have the Helm, the Wings, the Cannon, and the Sword. And we're going to ignore the Chassis due to its higher mana cost and higher rarity. And then we still have to fill out the rest of the deck, so there's an opportunity to put in the Swarm plan there as well, because our opponent will likely use at least some of their removal on things like the cannon, which has ranged and therefore is a reasonable threat, allowing us to potentially stick some Blood Moon Priestess value, or you know, they use their removal on the Blood Moon Priestess, and then we get to stick a Mechazor because they're out of dispels. So the plan is, by sort of shoehorning two combo decks into one, we get something that's a bit more powerful and a bit more resilient without having to put in all these expensive bombs just to absorb the opponent's interaction. However, the downside of that is we have a deck full of all these little cards that don't do that much in a sort of grindy or protracted matchup. However, Abyssian have one very, very spicy card that is exactly the thing we want. So the way I actually conceived of this deck, I was trying to find new ideas to build with Abyss, and I knew I wanted to put a mech deck in the series somewhere. And I was originally going to do, I was thinking of maybe Vitruvian or Magmar, and then I was thinking of Songhai with Ancestral Divination, and then I realised that you can do it in Abyssian as well, with this card, Rite of the Undervault. So, Rite of the Undervault is something of a departure for this series because, as you can probably see, it's an epic. This is a bit awkward because it's not, you know, obviously not the most budget-friendly thing ever. But I think in the interests of finding a deck that actually works and isn't just, oh hey, we built Swarm Abyss and took out all the good cards and put in some other stuff instead. You know, these kind of budget decks that are very obviously budget. This deck is actually its own thing. So at the end of the video, I'll go over things you can do to replace Rite of the Undervault. You know, you can play other card draw sources instead. But the lovely thing about Rite of the Undervault is it rewards us for playing a bunch of basically cheap rubbish cards. We spam out our hand, and then if the opponent isn't dead, we cast Rite of the Undervault, draw a new hand, and do it again. And at that point, we'll probably find enough combo pieces, enough Mechazor pieces, enough Swarm pieces to overwhelm their removal or get Mechazor out. And, you know, as an addendum, I've played 2 test games with this so far. In the first one, I didn't draw Rite of the Undervault, and I still won. So far so good. The deck should hopefully still at least work a bit without it, but I am essentially building around Rite of the Undervault here. The cool thing about this is that mech decks, if you play against mech decks on ladder, sometimes they get the nut draw where they have several of them in the opening hand and they play a Mechazor very quickly. But what normally happens is they'll play like 2 or 3 of them and then play a Sojourner or a Spelljammer, and you know, creatures that draw more cards. And you go, okay, so they don't have any more mechs in hand yet. And then it becomes kind of a race to see whether you can kill them before they, or you know, find an answer to Mechazor before they dig up the rest of the pieces and assemble, you know, the 5 they need to summon Mechazor. Rite of the Undervault has an advantage in that it's immediate and very fast. We're going to play a low curve deck that has a lot of cheap cards in it. You know, most of it's under 4 mana, which allows us to churn out our hand very quickly and play Rite of the Undervault on, say, turn 4 and just refill. We can draw 5 cards off of it quite easily. So this card is very powerful for us and pretty exciting to play with. So we're going to be playing Lilith because we want to play a Swarm strategy. Again, I would love to play Cassava, and don't let this prevent you from building Shadow Nova decks right now. You know, just try it out, give it a shot. In fact, get in touch with me if you want help. But I didn't really want to make a video on Shadow Nova control, knowing that it's going to be reworked, and not knowing how exactly the deck is going to look post Denizens of Shimzar, which is the name of the expansion. But as far as I'm aware, Lilith is staying the same, so we can trust her. So obviously the first thing to do is to throw in our build around. So build around is a term that it's sort of self-explanatory, but has a bit of nuance to it. As you can guess, it means we're building around this card. We are constructing our deck in such a way as to make use of and maximize the use of Rite of the Undervault. So, for instance, Shadow Dancer itself, which we'll come back to, is another build around, in that you can build a deck so that it makes good use out of her effect. So like a swarm deck that makes lots of Wraithlings and then kills them off. You can build around Shadow Nova by putting other creep generators in your deck and trying to get to the late game where you can maximize its value. Generally, cards that you build around don't do the best they could entirely by themselves. You know, there are cards like Primus Shieldmaster is just a 3/6 provoke. That's it. You know, that card is basically fine. You don't have to put any effort in to maximize it. You don't really need to do anything to get good use out of it. It's a piece of glue or a solid mid-rangey body that you can just throw out or throw in your deck and it'll be fine. Whereas we're doing some more synergistic things, so we're actually having to shape our deck to maximize the value of several of our cards. So in order to build around Rite of the Undervault, we're going to put in lots of little synergies full of cheap cards, which the mech squad is perfect for. So let's go there next. Again, we're going to ignore the expensive ones, but we want 3 helm, 3 wings, 3 cannon, and 3 sword. It's important to play as many mechs as you can, even in a deck with a powerful spell that draws 4 or 5 cards. It's not much use having mechs if you only draw 4 of them. You need to draw 5. After that, you tend to start replacing them because they aren't great as bodies, but we have enough, you know, we have good use for expendable fodder because of Rite of the Undervault. So having mechs past the 5th is also not the worst thing ever for us. So we want to put a decent number of them in the deck to get consistent, fast Mechazors, and because they're all, you know, they're pretty decent cards. They're understated, but they have surprising utility. We're not really playing the sort of deck that buffs them, but if you play mechs, say, in Vitruvian, they're all really good targets for things like Scion's First Wish, which gives it +1/+1 and draws a card. One of my favourite things to do as player 1 is to move forward, put Wings of Mechazor on the middle mana tile on the other side of the board, and play Scion's First Wish on it, and now there's a 2/5 in my opponent's face that just denied their mana tile. That's really funny. So we're not really going to be doing that, but we do have use for cheap raw bodies in the shape of the swarm stuff, which we'll get to next. So going back to the Abyssian faction cards, the other half of our combo deck, it's going to be a swarm element. So this goes with the Mechazor stuff reasonably well because your opponent will need to use removal on both halves. They'll want to remove Cannons of Mechazor in particular because ranged units can generate a lot of value very quickly by attacking things and not dying. They'll sometimes want to remove a Sword of Mechazor because that thing is a reasonable threat. They will obviously want to have removal for Mechazor itself if they have it in their deck. You know, they'll, for instance, might try and save a Dispel. But at the same time, they'll also need removal for Blood Moon Priestess. So, with a little luck, we can overwhelm their answers. So, the important part of any swarm strategy is kind of the setup. Playing one minion at a time is fine, but Abyssian has all these cards that are great for playing multiple minions at the same time, so we can use them. Gloom Chaser is not the best card ever, but it's, you know, pretty good in a swarm strategy, and it's good at gumming up the board early on. Sometimes the 1/1 just spawns in a really inconvenient place for your opponent, or takes a mana tile by accident, and you're just very happy. So we'll put in 3 of those. Somewhat more powerful is Wraithling Swarm. You might have seen some scary Abyssian openings where on turn 2, as player 2, Lilith can move forward, put a Wraithling on the mana tile, another one above it, and then a third Wraithling on one of the outer mana tiles, which leaves her with enough mana to play another 2-drop, which is sometimes a Gloom Chaser. Now she's got 5 minions on the board and has controlled most of the mana, which is a really powerful thing to do. So we definitely want to be able to do that. Then we need Blood Moon Priestess, who is arguably the most important card for a swarm deck. Blood Moon Priestess allows you to trade off your Wraithlings willy-nilly, whether or not you're profiting from the deaths in other ways, say with Shadow Dancers. Blood Moon means that your Wraithlings can just be used to deal damage for free. That's fantastic. Plus, you get more Wraithlings when your opponent's minions die, which is often going to be the case if you're constantly suiciding all your Wraithlings into them. So we definitely want the full 3 of those. Then we do want some swarm payoffs. So this deck isn't consistently going to be able to assemble a huge swarm because of the problems I mentioned earlier. You know, your opponent can just kill your Blood Moon Priestess, and then you're going to struggle. And obviously, Wraithlings are quite easy to remove individually. So if you don't have everything in the right order, and the opponent has some answers, it's really difficult to assemble a proper swarm payoff. But it's definitely worth including some, because we can dig for them. We only need a couple such cards, and they will come up both from replaces and from us drawing tons of cards off of Rite of the Undervault. So I'm going to put in a Soul Shatter Pact. This card is absolutely fine just to use on a Cannon of Mechazor to deal damage to something, or a sword for a little 5 damage AoE. But if you have a bunch of Wraithlings, Soul Shatter Pact can mean a lot of damage out of nowhere, so it's worth including. And the other one is, as we've mentioned before, Shadow Dancer. I'm a big fan of this card generally. It does a lot of nice things. Gaining life is obviously very useful. You know, this card is really good when you're racing your opponent, when you're both playing fairly aggressively. She pings artifacts. You know, if your opponent has an Arclight Regalia or something, Shadow Dancer is really good to help you grind through it. She's reasonably large, although you don't generally want to get her into combat because she dies somewhat too easily for how much value you can get out of her if she sticks on the board for a while. And she can put a lot of pressure on the opponent. Sometimes they want to kill your stuff in order to get out of a bind, but the additional damage they're going to be taking from the Shadow Dancer makes that really punishing. Unfortunately, at 5 mana and with the aforementioned setup constraints that I was talking about a moment ago, we do only want one of them. But hopefully we can replace into or write into her when we have the opportunity come up and get some really good value. So we've sort of got a deck. We've definitely got the shell of something, but we need some removal and we need to flesh out a Monica if we want more cheap stuff, more early plays, and more consistent turn 1 plays for either side of the board. So I'm not going to put Dark Transformation in this deck. It is expensive. You know, we want to avoid things that are 5 mana, because 5 mana is when we cast Rite of the Undervault, ideally having emptied our hand prior to that point. So we want cheap stuff like Demonic Lure. So Demonic Lure is really good at getting rid of 2/3s very early on. You can teleport them next to Lilith, deal them 1 damage, and then hit them. So that's invaluable for getting rid of things like a turn 1 Kaido Assassin or Chakri Avatar from the opponent. But it's also great just for punting large minions to the other side of the board. They can walk back in a couple of turns, but by that point you'll maybe have killed the opponent or drawn something to deal with them. So we want the full set. And a great card in Swarm decks is Ritual Banishing. This is really good with Lilith's Bloodborne spell. It's good with Gloom Chaser, it's good with Wraithling Swarm. It's also good with, Helm of Mechazor. Like, you don't care that much about card advantage in this deck, thanks to, again, Rite of the Undervault. It is slightly clunky, and it's 3 mana, so we're only going to want 2 copies. And finally, we need to just throw in as much decent, cheap interaction as we can find. So first up is Eternal staple, Blood Tear Alchemist. Has this been in every single deck that I've put up so far? It might have. This card is just so good. It does a lot. We don't need pings as much as some other factions do because we already have a bunch of Wraithlings. But Blood Tear is cheap, hits instantly, there's no messing around, it just does work. So we're going to want 2 of those. Grasp of Agony. So this card is a bit odd. It's hard to line up and opponents can play around it. But it is handy to have one in your deck because sometimes it just does what you need. You know, even if it's just 1 mana, deal 3 to one other minion, that's great. You know, if that was a card, you'd just play it, right? That's fantastic. Grasp of Agony requires a bit more setup than that, but it can also have some absurd payoffs once in a while. It's pretty nice as a one-off. Void Pulse. So this card confused me when I started playing, because I come from a Magic the Gathering background, and you know, this is essentially card disadvantage. You're playing a card to do nothing except affect the life totals. So unless you're really pressuring their health, which you're not normally doing with Abyssians, I thought, it's not very exciting. And unless they're really pressuring your health, spending a card to gain 3 life is also not very exciting. Since then, I've sort of come around on it. You know, just a 5-point life swing is just, sometimes you need that. You know, sometimes this card will just quietly swing a game by itself. For only 1 mana, that's not terrible. But the real reason it's in this deck is, of course, Rite of the Undervault, which it's great with. You know, being able to empty the hand and then Rite to refill is great. You can use Void Pulse to chip artifacts down, which is really useful, and just getting that little bit of extra life against aggressive decks, and a little bit of help in racing them down, makes a bigger difference than it would look. So I'm going to put 2 of those in. And finally, it would be good to have a little bit more oomph in the 2-drop department, and as luck would have it, we have Primus Fist. Primus Fist is fantastic for this deck. We have so many tiny creatures that benefit massively from the +2 attack that allow us to make some really nice little tempo swings. So we're going to put a full set of those in, and that brings us to 40. So just to recoup, we are building around Rite of the Undervault by playing a lot of cheap synergistic cards that will be fairly easily answered by the opponent early on, but over time will be more difficult to deal with as we play more and more and more of them. Rite of the Undervault allows us to empty our hand of chaff, get whatever value from it we can, and then just reload and do it all again when the opponent's already a little bit lower on answers than they would otherwise be. It's great with the Mechazor squad because it essentially lets us have 2 opening hands worth of mechs. It's great with the Swarm because it allows us to find, you know, second copies of Blood Moon Priestess quickly, or fuel up on large numbers of creatures to spam out to the board. And it's great at finding one of win conditions and utility cards like Shadow Dancer and Soul Shatter Pact. So overall we have a very low curve, lean, low to the ground deck with a couple of different ways to win, as well as the good old hit them in the face until they stop moving, which, you know, our creatures aren't very big, but we have a lot of them thanks to Rite of the Undervault, so eventually our opponents will run out of life. And that's that. I was maybe a little short-sighted in calling the Golem deck Robot Wars when I hadn't built a mech deck yet, but I did find quite a nice name for this deck, which is a bit of the old Fallout reference. So I'm going with that. Right, before I call this video to a close, I promised advice on how to replace Rite of the Undervault. So obviously it's a card draw spell and it's kind of integral to the deck, so you want to replace it with more card draw. Personally, I would, for every Rite of the Undervault you don't own, I would play a Blazehound and a Sojourner and cut one of these 1 mana spells, Grasp of Agony and Void Pulse. Cut Void Pulses first because Grasp of Agony is removal, and can still, you know, deal them 3 in the face once in a while. So, if, for instance, if you only own 2 rights and you don't want to craft a third, or you can't craft a third, play 1 Blazehound and 1 Sojourner and cut 1 Void Pulse. And that means that if you don't have any rights, your deck will look like, right, Blazehound and Sojourner. Your deck will look like this. So the reason I'm not going with this as the main build is this deck still cares about, this version of the deck still cares about how many cards it has in its hand, and Sojourner is somewhat vulnerable to being answered or stolen by the ever nasty Zenry. Apparently the search doesn't like my spelling of Zenry. Oh, there we go. Yeah, Zenry is Sojourner's worst nightmare, and we don't have ways to make Sojourner larger here. Now, that doesn't necessarily matter until you're in the higher reaches of the ladder where this card is a bit more common, but it's something to bear in mind as you climb and as you grow as a player. That Sojourner does have that somewhat important vulnerability. But yeah, the real reason is that although Blazehound and card draw in general are quite well suited to decks like this where you just want to splurge out your hand and then refill, they don't allow you to be quite so cavalier as Rite of the Undervault, which actively encourages you to play cards for the most minimal of effects just to get them out of your hand, do something small, and then you draw a replacement. And I really wanted to build around that effect and that sort of sheer magnitude of card draw. So this version of the deck, you'll have to play slightly more conservatively. It'll still work, right? I mean, as I mentioned, I won a game with this without drawing any Rites of the Undervault. So it can definitely be done. And if the opponent doesn't have removal for your first Blood Moon Priestess, you're going to probably win regardless of what's in the rest of the deck. But it's worth bearing in mind that the playstyle of this version will be somewhat different to the playstyle of the fully equipped version. So if you want to build this deck, go for it. Please do. Let me know how it goes. Give it a good test run, and work towards Rite of the Undervault as you can. Even if you just put 1 or 2 in, that's fine. 3 is sometimes overkill. And let me know what you think. So I'm going to do the games with the fully fledged Rite of the Undervault version, in part because I'm quite proud of this. I really like this idea. I haven't seen anyone do this before, this mechs with Rite of the Undervault version, and maybe that's because it's actually bad and I haven't realized yet, but so far it seems really, really sweet, and I'm kind of keen to see where it goes. So again, I hope you'll forgive me putting an epic in my budget new player video, but again, if you want help building the Shadow Nova decks, which are generally much more budget amenable because you can play a lot of basics and commons, get in touch. I will happily chip in. I've got a list myself that should be fairly easily adapted to be budget friendly, because I don't have a lot of the expensive Abyssian cards myself, so I don't run anything more terrifyingly expensive than some Dioltesses. But until then, let's roll with this. So as usual, I'm going to take a short break. I'm going to end the video here, rest my voice a bit, and then I'll come back in part 2, jump on the ladder, maybe show you a cool replay, and we'll see how the deck performs.